everyone. My name is Michelle Rinehart, and I'm an Employer Services Manager here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I'm co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the first in a two-part series titled Retaining a Qualified Workforce, Part 1, Aging into a Disability. Julie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Michelle, and hello, everyone. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I provide education for employers that is focused on creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. This includes discussing the guidelines under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It includes identifying ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations and sharing best practices and guidance for making the workplace accessible. Because my role includes connecting employers with helpful information and resources, I'd like to share that today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, known as GAD. The purpose of GAD is to get all of us thinking, talking, and learning about making the digital environment accessible and inclusive for all people, including people with disabilities. The digital environment includes things like web-based services and content and other digital products. So for more information, please visit the GAD Foundation's website at www.accessibility.day.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a helpful learner's guide, which can be accessed now through the link that's posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope this information is helpful for you. Also, OOD does not endorse products, services, or vendors. However, we will share examples throughout the webinar to illustrate possible solutions and resources for reasonable accommodations. We'll be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and again before we conclude to answer any questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so they're ready for us when we stop. Julie, would you like to address the accessibility practices we have included in today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also, in our delivery, Michelle and I mention each other by name as the conversation between us goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
Thank you, Julie. As we begin today's webinar, I'd like to acknowledge that many employers are striving to create diverse workplaces that are inclusive of individuals with disabilities. This generally involves strategies focused on the hiring and onboarding processes. However, inclusive employers ensure these efforts include retaining qualified employees who acquire a disability during their career. And that's the focus of this two-part webinar series.
That's right, Michelle. What we mean by an acquired disability is the individual was not born with a disability, but developed one during their lifetime. An employee may acquire a disability due to the aging process, an injury, an accident, or the onset of a medical condition. According to the 2016 census, 70% of people with a disability between the ages of 20 and 64 acquired their disability after the age of 16. Which means many people are employed before the onset of their disability. So it's important for these employees to have access to what they need to remain in the workplace and feel included. Employers who make efforts to include employees who acquire disabilities in their inclusion efforts will be better poised to retain this valuable workforce.
Julie, today's webinar focuses on what is unique about providing accommodations and creating inclusive workplaces related to employees who age into a disability.
Yes, and we will begin with a discussion on aging that includes some myth busting. Then we will address when an age-related condition rises to the level of being a disability under the ADA. We will talk about common limitations that may accompany an age-related disability and provide examples of effective, reasonable accommodations to enable older employees with disabilities to continue to perform their job's essential functions. And then we will conclude with sharing ways employers can foster a workplace culture that is inclusive of an aging workforce. Part 2 of this series will address retaining employees who acquire disabilities through an accident, injury, or the onset of a medical condition.
Julie, as you were collecting resources for today's webinar and sharing some of the statistics with the team, one of the statistics you found struck me as fascinating. At the present time, and for the first time in history, there are 5 generations in the workplace. So this is in part because life expectancy has increased over the past 100 years, and many people are continuing to work past the traditional retirement age. So to be successful, employers need the talent and skills each of these generations offer, including the value and experience older employees, including older employees with disabilities, bring to an organization.
Michelle, you are right. And I am also fascinated by the fact that we have 5 generations in the workplace and agree this is a wonderful opportunity to blend the experience, wisdom, and unique ability of all generations. I found a quote from the American Association of Retired Persons, known as AARP, that stated, for the first time in modern history, 20-year-old new hires can find themselves working side by side with colleagues who are older than they are by 50 years or more.
Julie, that's amazing and increasingly becoming the norm. To reinforce this, let's share some statistics related to aging and the workforce.
Michelle, you mentioned that Americans are living longer. I have some statistics related to aging and work that I'd like to share. We included the resources these statistics come from in the learner's guide that accompanies this webinar. So here are the statistics we found. At the beginning of the 20th century, life expectancy was under 50 years old. 100 years later, life expectancy has increased to nearly 77 years old. Currently, around 40 million Americans are over the age of 65. As of 2020, 1/3 of the US workforce was comprised of employees aged 50 and older. The labor force in 2024 is projected to be about 164 million people, which will include about 41 million people aged 55 and older. These increases are attributed to the aging baby boomer generation, which is the generation born between 1946 and 1964, working later in life because they are healthier, they have a longer life expectancy, and they are better educated. These increases are also reportedly due to changes in Social Security benefits and employee retirement plans, which leave some older employees working longer to save more for retirement.
Julie, all of these statistics emphasize the likelihood that employers have aging employees in their workforce, some of whom may be managing disabilities for the first time in their life. Because the talent, skills, and experience older employees contribute to the workplace, this population of employees is tremendously valuable to employers. Unfortunately, there are misconceptions and stereotypes that exist about older employees. Let's debunk some of these through the information provided on the Ohio Department of Aging's website. I'll share the myth and you can provide the fact.
Sounds good, Michelle.
Julie, the first myth is older workers are sick more often and cost more to employ.
Michelle, the fact is, older workers use fewer sick days than younger workers in general, and they can cost an employer less from a healthcare perspective for 2 reasons. First, they often do not have children as dependents to include on their health plans. And second, workers who are 65 or older are generally eligible for Medicare.
Julie, there's a myth that older workers have difficulty solving problems, evaluating information, making decisions, and being quality oriented.
Michelle, the fact here is older adults tend to have superior interpersonal and problem-solving skills. They are also generally better at dealing with coworkers and customers than younger workers. Older adults may benefit from the patience they gain through experience. Instead of acting based on emotion, they can apply this patience to stressful situations that require them to think objectively.
Julie, how about the myth that older workers are not as productive as younger workers?
Michelle, the Department of Aging's resource shares that workplace wisdom is the greatest asset of an older worker. Wisdom gained through experience can lead to improvement of every aspect of the job, including productivity. This experience leads to the older worker knowing where to invest time and effort to avoid mistakes. Older workers avoid distractions better than younger employees, and they know how to maintain contacts, close relationships, and ask for help when needed.
Julie, there's also a myth that older workers have a difficult time learning new skills and technologies.
Michelle, training costs for older employees are generally lower, and it makes sense. Older employees have been in the workforce for a while and have seen many technologies come and go. They have experience with doing things in other ways, which they couple with an awareness of related topics, giving them an edge when it comes to learning new approaches.
Julie, what about the myth that older workers are more likely to quit their job, which makes training them not a worthy investment?
Michelle, simply put, a 50-year-old employee is more likely to remain with an employer than a 20 or 30-year-old employee.
Julie, our final myth is older workers are less physically capable of performing the job and more prone to having accidents.
Michelle, while older adults may experience physical and cognitive changes with age, older workers are better able to compensate for these changes due to their experience and are less likely than younger workers to have accidents at work.
Julie, this myth and fact exercise emphasizes the importance of retaining a qualified aging workforce because there are many benefits older employees bring to the organization.
Michelle, I'd like to recap some of these valuable contributions and share a few we haven't highlighted. Older employees certainly bring experience and technical expertise to their work. They can also exhibit the qualities that come from maturity, like wisdom, discretion, and judgment. Older employees can serve as effective mentors for younger employees, offering support without a sense of competition. They can also bring awareness to and share innovative ideas about how the employer's products and services can meet the needs of its aging customers. Remember, we said life expectancy has increased. And making efforts to retain qualified older employees who have acquired a disability helps an employer to offset the ongoing labor shortage so many organizations are experiencing.
Hey, Julie, we know life expectancy has increased. We also know the 65 plus age groups are the fastest growing in the labor force. And we've shared the many benefits that older employees contribute to the workplace. But we also know that older employees can age into a disability. What are some common disabilities or limitations that occur through the aging process? And do these always result in acquiring a disability?
Michelle, I'll start with the first part of your question. Research and statistics reveal limitations and disability often come with aging. These can lead to difficulties with vision, hearing, mobility, and thinking. However, these limitations do not mean older employees have to stop contributing to the workforce or to their economic well-being. Employers who embrace disability-inclusive workplace cultures understand that accommodating a qualified aging workforce is an excellent way to retain a qualified workforce.
Julie, when does an age-related limitation become a disability under the ADA?
Michelle, first, I'd like to emphasize that age itself is not a disability. However, an individual who has a medical condition that is often associated with age may have an impairment or limitation that rises to the level of a disability under the ADA. Secondly, it's important to know the ADA does not have a list of medical conditions that automatically qualify a person as having a disability. A person is considered under the ADA to have a disability when the person is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, or is someone who has a record of such an impairment, or someone who is regarded as having such an impairment. So a person who develops a medical condition as they age may age into a disability when the condition makes it more difficult to participate in major life activities like hearing, seeing, walking, thinking, getting around at home, participating in the community, or working. Now, many people who age into a disability may not consider themselves to have a disability. However, if older workers begin to have difficulties performing the job, they may be eligible for and have a right to workplace accommodations.
Julie, this seems like a good idea to review what reasonable accommodation is and when it's required to be provided.
Michelle, under Title I of the ADA, covered employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified individuals with disabilities when they're needed to participate in the hiring process, perform the job, and enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment. So employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation at any point during the employment cycle, which includes when an employee who has not previously needed an accommodation and now does due to an age-related disability. A reasonable accommodation is a change in the customary way a work-related activity is accessed or performed to enable an individual with a disability to participate just as effectively in another way. When an employee reports a limitation accessing an environment or performing the job related to a disability or medical condition, the employer should consider this a request for a reasonable accommodation and begin the interactive process promptly. This is the informal process the employer engages in with the employee to work together to identify the work-related barrier, the disability-related limitation, and determine the effective solution. It's important to note many older workers will remain working productively with no limitations or no need for accommodations. And remember, employees with disabilities often do not need accommodations at work, but when they do, accommodations can be low cost and simple to implement.
Julie, I'm looking forward to talking about some of these reasonable accommodations shortly. But before we do, let's stop to answer questions. Just so everyone is aware, we did receive some pre-submitted questions with the registration. I'd also like to give the employers attending today a chance to interact with us. So we'd like to hear from you about the benefits you've experienced from having a multi-generational workforce. We'd love it if you would share this with us by entering your answer into the Q&A box, and we'll read some of those during the break. Right. So I don't see any questions here, so I will pull up our pre-submitted questions. So the first question that we received was, how do we deal with increasing workers' comp claims that are actually age-related?
Thank you for this question, Michelle. This is Julie. When you're looking at your workers' compensation claims, I would recommend talking with your workers' compensation professionals to help identify any commonality that you notice with these claims. It sounds like from the question that there's been a trend related to age-related claims. As we just mentioned, there's a variety of conditions and limitations that a person may age into. And so you may be able to look at this information even more closely to determine if it's related to activities related to hearing or vision or mobility, and then put together a plan with your workers' compensation professionals to see how you can best manage this in your work environment from a workers' comp perspective. The Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation has many helpful resources for employers to address wellness and prevention, and also safety and ergonomics in your particular work environment. Some of these we'll be sharing in part 2 of this series in the next webinar.
Thanks, Julie. We did have a question just come in through the chat. Can you please comment on remote work as a reasonable accommodation?
Sure. So there are a variety of types of reasonable accommodations, and one of those is looking at restructuring the job, which can include looking at where we're performing the job. So in the office, remotely, or in some type of a hybrid type of situation. And so when an employer receives a request for working remotely as an accommodation, and they're going through the interactive process, some of the things that they consider are whether or not the job's essential functions can be performed remotely, At times that's the case that they can be. At other times, maybe some can be and some have to be performed on site, maybe because of access to certain data or records or tools and equipment. You also want to look at whether or not supervision can occur effectively in a remote work environment. And so, the decision here is going to be case by case based on the type of job and the work environment. Sometimes the solution might be that this is permissible. Sometimes it might be that we look at a hybrid situation where those essential functions that have to be performed on site require you to be there for a portion of the time. And you can also look at, are there options to make the work environment accessible, such as relocating a workstation, providing a quiet private office, maybe providing noise canceling devices. And so it's really a customized conversation in that interactive process.
Thanks, Julie. We have 2 more pre-submitted questions. So the next one is, what challenges are you experiencing in the workplace now that we have a new aged workforce? People are now working longer than before instead of retiring. Due to this, are there any adjustments that have to be made in work practices because of servicing a greater tenured work population? For example, when organizations conduct hiring events and recruitment, the emphasis is usually placed on the Gen Z and now the Gen Alpha groups. Do any of these hiring events specifically recruit individuals in the generation that would normally be retiring?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for this pre-submitted question. So, our focus in putting this webinar together was on retaining the workforce that you have. And so we haven't put information about the hiring process into the content of this webinar, but thank you for asking about that. So certainly as we continue, we'll talk about limitations and accommodation solutions related to older employees staying in the work environment beyond the traditional retirement age. But we can share some ideas about how an employer may want to attract this qualified workforce in their hiring process. So one strategy that an employer could consider is where you're putting your job postings or where you're announcing the job openings that you have, and consider where older adults are searching for jobs. Maybe post the open positions through job boards that are sponsored by organizations like AARP, which is, again, the American Association of Retired Persons, or consider posting through college and university alumni groups. Also, when you are creating the job posting, think about the language that you're using, and to make that language more inclusive for the older population, maybe consider avoiding terms like recent grads, energetic, and high potential, which might be terms that are perceived as being young, and instead create messages that are more inclusive, that use terms like mature, experienced, reliable, to let older candidates know that they're encouraged to apply for these open positions.
Oh, thanks, Julie. And then one more. What should an employer do if they notice an older employee struggling, but who doesn't ask for an accommodation because they don't acknowledge they have a disability?
Thank you. This is a great question. And, it's with the best of intentions that when we feel like an employee or we observe an employee having difficulty and we think we know why, that we want to do something because we want to help. And so, this can occur in a variety of ways. This is one where we have an aging workforce. What we always recommend is that you would approach this the way you would with any employee that you notice having difficulty on the job. So focus your conversation on the job-related aspect of what you're noticing. Talk about the performance metrics of the job, such as, maybe what the productivity expectation is and what you're observing in their low performance that is suggesting that there is some level of difficulty. And then simply ask what you can do to help. What you don't want to do is ask about disability or a medical condition. If the person's response includes sharing with you a barrier that they're experiencing related to a medical condition or a disability, this is a request for a reasonable accommodation. It can be that simple. So this would be your cue to begin the interactive process, which might mean you direct this person to talk with the appropriate person in human resources who handles the interactive process. If the person doesn't share a barrier or a limitation related to disability, or if they choose to decline help, just let them know who they can contact at a later date if they do want to talk about a solution.
Thanks, Julie. And thank you everyone for your questions. We're going to take another break before we finish, so please post any more questions that you have in the Q&A box. Okay, Julie, let's revisit the limitations often associated with age-related disabilities in more detail, and we'll share some examples of reasonable accommodations that can be effective in enabling older employees with disabilities to perform their jobs.
Michelle, the conditions a person can age into vary. Some examples can include mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, physical conditions like diabetes or osteoarthritis, or sensory conditions like being hard of hearing or having visual changes. Some of these may be readily apparent as they develop over time, but many of these conditions are not apparent and what we call invisible disabilities. These conditions may result in limitations that cause a person to need an accommodation related to accessing the work environment and performing the job. So the three main categories of limitations we are going to talk about today and provide examples for include cognitive limitations, which impact functions like thinking and memory, physical limitations, which can impact functions like mobility and fine motor control, and sensory limitations, which impact functions like hearing and seeing. Just as a reminder, not all aging workers will develop health conditions, and not all older workers with disabilities have limitations that require accommodations in the workplace. However, when an accommodation is needed, it's important to remember that determining the effective solution is always based on a case-by-case analysis because each individual, each job, and each workplace is unique.
Julie, those are great reminders. Let's start by discussing the limitations that may be present with mental health conditions and share some examples of reasonable accommodations that may be effective.
Michelle, mental health conditions can impact a person's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. This can lead to difficulty with the ability to remember or recall, or difficulty with concentration and focus, managing time and tasks, and limitations with managing stress.
Julie, how about I share how these limitations may impact performing work, and then you can share the accommodation ideas.
Good idea, Michelle.
Okay, so a limitation with memory can impact a person's ability to remember or recall information. How this shows up in the workplace is a person may not be able to recall items like dates, names, passwords, facts, and the steps of a process. I imagine there are many ideas for accommodations employers can consider.
Michelle, there are a variety of ideas, many of which are minimal in cost and simple to implement. Some ideas include implementing strategies like creating written checklists, using sticky notes or apps for reminders, using a color coding system to prioritize tasks, permitting training refreshers, and utilizing a job coach or an on-site mentor. One idea that can benefit all employees is to distribute the notes taken during meetings and trainings that all employees can reference as needed.
Julie, that's a good point about how some of these ideas can benefit all employees, and sharing meeting minutes is simple enough to do. But mental health condition can also lead to a limitation with concentration, which can include being easily distracted and having difficulty focusing. This can impact the workplace by making it difficult to tune out background noise and visual distractions and focus on work tasks. What accommodations can help with concentration?
Michelle, there are a variety of ways employers can minimize auditory and visual distractions in the work environment. These include utilizing space enclosures like cubicles and installing sound absorption panels. Another option could be to provide a private office or white noise or sound machines. Ideas specific to visual distractions include providing alternative lighting. This can mean turning off a bank of overhead lights and using task lighting, positioning a workstation near a window for access to natural lighting or away from natural lighting to avoid glare, and could also include placing filters over overhead fluorescent lights to soften lighting instead of turning the lights off entirely.
Julie, time management can also be impacted. Time management involves organizing and planning the use of time to complete tasks and activities. A limitation with this can be caused by a difficulty with self-initiating tasks, marking time as it passes, and gauging the amount of time a task needs. How this impacts work is an employee may have difficulty beginning tasks on time, handling multiple responsibilities, and meeting project deadlines.
Michelle, the ideas I have for time management can benefit everyone with organizing and completing their work and also be an effective accommodation. One idea is to use a calendar to block time. This is a tool an employee can use to allocate how much time to spend working on a task. Project due dates can also be assigned. I use my calendar frequently to stay on track with creating training content and providing worksite accessibility consults for employers. Another idea is to arrange work in the order of the tasks that need to be completed from start to finish. This concept can also be applied to how the materials and tools used to perform the job are organized. It might be helpful to arrange these in the order they will be used. An employee could also be permitted to program an alert on a computer or smart device as a reminder to stop one task and begin another, or to notify them it is time for a break. I know I get caught up in writing training materials, so I often rely on the alerts I set for my upcoming meetings to help make sure I don't miss them. To assist with determining how much time to allocate to a task, providing a mentor can help convey that information.
Julie, I like these ideas, especially the idea of prioritizing work in the order it needs to be completed and then combining that with blocking time on the calendar. I might incorporate those into my workflow too. Okay, we have one last limitation related to mental health disabilities to discuss. This limitation is with managing stress and emotions, which could result from health conditions like depression and anxiety. Symptoms related to emotional stress can cause physical, mental, and behavioral symptoms like headaches, neck and back pain and fatigue, feeling overwhelmed, difficulty remembering things, trouble concentrating, and difficulty with making decisions and problem solving. These symptoms can impact job performance and make it difficult to get work done. What kind of accommodations might be helpful for managing stress?
Michelle, two ideas come to mind specific to stress management. The first is to offer a flexible schedule. An employee who has a mental health condition that impacts the ability to manage stress may need to flex their schedule to attend weekly therapy sessions for a period of time. Permitting the employee to leave early one day a week and make up the time another day can be a helpful solution in some cases. Another idea is to permit modified breaks. For example, an employee who could combine two smaller breaks into a larger one to perform stress management techniques, such as breathing exercises in a private space. This may be an effective way the employee can manage their stress during their shift and then return to work better able to focus on job tasks.
Julie, you've shared some helpful examples, and again, some of these are simple to implement and do not have an associated cost. Okay, let's talk about the limitations that can occur when an employee ages into a physical disability.
Michelle, there are a variety of health conditions that can impact an aging employee from a physical perspective and limit the ability to perform material handling, such as lifting, carrying, pushing, and pulling, or impact a person's positional tolerances, such as how long a person can sit, stand, walk, or climb. Physical disabilities can impact fine motor and grasping abilities and can lead to a need to manage a condition while at work, such as taking medication or taking breaks.
Julie, let's start with material handling. What kind of work activities are these specifically?
Michelle, material handling can include tasks like transporting supplies or packages from a storage area to the office by carrying, pushing, or pulling these items. When it comes to moving materials from one place to another, the use of a dolly, ergonomic cart, or a motorized cart can be a helpful solution. Now, some of these items I've mentioned here do come with a cost. However, sometimes employers permit these items to be used by all employees to lessen the physical demand of work, improve comfort, and increase safety.
Julie, I imagine the benefit of retaining a qualified employee outweighs the cost of the accommodation in these cases. Okay, so when we talk about positional tolerances, we're referring to the positions we sustain or perform repetitively to do the job, like sitting, standing, walking, and climbing. Some version of these are used in nearly every job. I imagine there are several ways these can be accommodated in the various work environments.
Michelle, you are right. There are many solutions, and the correct one will be unique to the type of job being performed and the work environment. For example, in an office setting, a sit-stand workstation may be an effective solution for an accountant who needs to alternate between sitting and standing during their workday. For a retail associate or a hotel clerk, a standing height stool may enable the employee to maintain a stationary position while working with customers and guests. An aging employee with osteoarthritis and a limitation with walking who works in a downtown environment and has to park and then navigate to the office building may benefit from a dedicated, accessible parking space to reduce the distance to the office entrance. Relocating the employee's workstation to the main floor and close to the entrance may be another helpful accommodation.
Julie, I have seen some employers provide sit-stand workstations for all employees who want them. So this is another example of an item that can be an effective, reasonable accommodation and be beneficial for all employees. Now let's talk about physical disabilities that limit fine motor tasks like dexterity and the use of fingers, as well as grasping activities that require using the hands. This is another category that likely has many ideas to consider.
Michelle, let's start with the office environment. Many of us use computers to work, which often requires using input devices like a mouse and keyboard. For an aging employee with arthritis, using these devices may be difficult. A solution could be to use an ergonomic split keyboard, a trackball style mouse, or speech recognition software, which allows the employee to dictate information into the computer instead of typing. For an employee who works in a manufacturing setting and uses a variety of tools, solutions may include using anti-vibration gloves and power tools.
Great ideas, Julie. An aspect of accommodating physical disabilities that may not be as obvious includes managing medical needs and symptoms. As you mentioned earlier, this could include things like accommodating the need to take medication or rest breaks. What ideas can employers consider?
Michelle, one type of reasonable accommodation we haven't mentioned yet in this webinar is modifying a policy. In some workplaces, employers have policies that prohibit employees from having food and drink at their workstations. When an employee has a medical condition, like type 2 diabetes, they may need to take medications on a regular schedule and with food or water. So as an accommodation, the employer may need to consider modifying their policy to permit the employee to do so. For employees who age into conditions like chronic pain or chronic fatigue, they may need to manage their discomfort and endurance. And one effective way to do this is through taking breaks as needed to rest or perform stretching activities in a private space. In this case, an employer could consider providing a modified break schedule for the employee to manage their condition.
Julie, I'm starting to catch on that some of these types of accommodations, like modifying a break schedule, can be used for a variety of types of disabilities. You mentioned earlier using this accommodation for stress management, and now you've shared how it can be helpful with managing pain and endurance. I think that's helpful to know. Okay, that brings us to our final category of disability an employee may age into, sensory disabilities.
Michelle, sensory disabilities are common to age into, and in this webinar, we will focus on those that impact seeing and hearing. A job accommodation network resource we consulted included these statistics. Anyone aged 35 or older is at risk for developing presbyopia, which is a type of vision loss that impacts the ability to focus on nearby objects. And about 1 in 3 people in our country between age 65 and 74 has hearing loss.
Julie, let's address visual disabilities first. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, known as the CDC, the primary causes of blindness and low vision are age-related eye diseases. These are conditions like macular degeneration, cataracts, diabetic retinopathy, and glaucoma, which can all impact the ability to see clearly, to drive, or can result in loss of usable vision.
Michelle, because these are common conditions to age into, and because aging employees are working longer, employers will benefit from being familiar with how these conditions can impact the workplace and what kinds of accommodations are helpful. An employee with diabetic retinopathy may have vision loss that impacts the ability to see printed materials and information on a computer monitor. An effective solution for this employee may be to provide magnification. possibly in the form of a stand magnifier for printed materials, and in the form of software on the computer to control the size of text and images in various digital applications. Sometimes the limitations that come with age-related vision loss impact navigating the workspace. One idea to consider is to make sure common areas like hallways and entrances have adequate lighting. Another idea is to use color contrast to distinguish pathways to important areas like restrooms, and make sure signage uses large print and proper contrast. Another helpful idea is to combine color contrast with a tactile element for things like staircases.
Julie, those are important accommodations to make for navigating the workspace effectively for everyone. Okay, let's wrap up our ideas for reasonable accommodations by sharing some ideas for disabilities that impact hearing. According to the National Institute on Aging, age-related hearing loss comes on gradually, may make it difficult to tolerate loud noises, causes limitations with understanding what is being said, and customarily impacts both ears equally. Because these changes happen slowly over time, older employees experiencing hearing loss may not realize this or consider themselves to have a disability. What ideas do you have for employers to consider?
Michelle, one accommodation idea that could be helpful for meetings, presentations, and events is captioning. Captioning can come in a variety of formats, like live captioning provided on site or remotely by a trained stenographer. This may be helpful for events like presentations and large meetings. Captioning can also be provided through artificial intelligence, known as AI, through virtual platforms like the one we are using today, Microsoft Teams. The important difference to note between using a trained stenographer and AI is that AI customarily includes some level of errors in spelling and punctuation, which makes it an ineffective solution in some situations. Another accommodation to consider is an assistive listening device that can be used with or without hearing aids to amplify the sounds in the workplace, such as conversations between coworkers. Of course, which device is effective for the employee and the work setting will be unique. One last idea I'll share is for employees whose hearing disability makes it difficult to tolerate loud noises. An accommodation can be as simple as relocating the employee's workstation away from high traffic and noisy areas, or providing the employee a private office where they can close the door as needed.
Julie, thank you for all these wonderful accommodation ideas. You've given employers many ways to consider providing solutions for aging employees with disabilities. The final topic we want to address today is about fostering a workplace culture that's inclusive of older workers, including older workers who age into a disability. Near the beginning of today's webinar, we discussed the benefits older workers contribute to the workplace, such as their experience and expertise, wisdom and judgment, and innovative ideas. We also discussed how retaining this qualified workforce is a great strategy for employers who are experiencing a labor shortage, as many are.
Michelle, it seems it would be much better to retain the qualified workforce an employer has than to lose the valuable benefits you mentioned, plus incur the cost of recruiting and onboarding a new employee. One strategy employers can use to retain aging employees is to remember their disability inclusion efforts should address more than just the hiring process. These efforts should address all aspects of employment and include candidates, new and existing employees, and aging employees with disabilities. We will discuss some ideas and resources so employers can consider what strategies are best to implement in their workplaces.
Julie, I know we just talked about reasonable accommodations. Let's discuss what strategies employers can adopt specific to this topic.
Michelle, that's a great topic to discuss because providing reasonable accommodations in an inclusive way is a great tool for employers to use in their inclusion practices. So here are some ideas. First, although it's not required, establishing a formal reasonable accommodation process and assigning responsibility for receiving and facilitating requests is helpful in ensuring all employees with disabilities, including older employees with disabilities, have what they need to do their jobs. Second, it may have been quite some time since a tenured employee attended onboarding where they received information about this process. If they didn't need an accommodation then, they may have forgotten about the right to reasonable accommodation. So make sure to provide periodic training for all employees on the process and how to make a request. And one last best practice to consider is to include a reasonable accommodation statement in key areas in the workplace. Often employers remember to include these on their hiring websites and in invitations to events like interviews and onboarding. But remember to include this statement in key areas related to current employees' work activities. These include in job descriptions, invitations to meetings and events, and when measuring performance using artificial intelligence.
Julie, those strategies seem like a great way to keep all employees informed about the rights of reasonable accommodation, so employees with disabilities can ask for what they need. Some employers adopt the strategy of providing some accommodations for all employees, so anyone who needs the accommodation can ask for it without having a disability and without navigating the interactive process.
Michelle, that's one of my favorite strategies. And depending on the type of job and work environments employers have, there are quite a variety of accommodations that can be considered. Accommodations that might help to retain a qualified aging workforce include providing magnification software to use with applications on the computer, permitting a flexible schedule and telework, providing noise canceling earbuds and assistive listening devices, providing ergonomic keyboards, mice, and sit-stand workstations, permitting a modified break schedule, and using a sensory room to manage symptoms.
Julie, there's certainly quite a few options to consider. Let's talk a bit more about ways an employer could provide a flexible workplace in a way that might retain aging employees with disabilities.
Michelle, according to the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, known as EARN, workplace flexibility can be key to retaining this valuable workforce. This resource suggests 4 ways employers can consider this. The first is to consider permitting part-time positions or job sharing. Many older workers prefer to continue working but may not want to work full-time. The next idea is to offer temporary work when coverage is needed for employees who are on vacation or leave. Older adults who are familiar with the employer's work tasks and environment may need minimal to no training to fill this type of role. Employers could also consider offering seasonal work or snowbird programs. This kind of program appeals to older adults who spend part of the year in a warmer climate and then return home after the winter.
Julie, those sound like appealing work options for older adults who need the flexibility in their schedule of when they're available for work. Okay, let's share some resources to assist employers with their efforts to foster workplace cultures that are inclusive of older adults with disabilities.
Michelle, EARN has a resource on its website called Retain. And this includes strategies to retain qualified and valuable employees with disabilities that addresses retaining employees who acquire a disability due to aging. There are 2 strategies I'd like to highlight from this resource. The first is the suggestion to make sure the technology used in the workplace is accessible for all employees, including employees who need screen magnification, who use speech recognition software, and who benefit from turning on captions. The next is to ensure universal design is applied in the workplace, which means the workplace is designed to be accessible and usable by as many people as possible, including older adults with disabilities. This can include making sure meetings are accessible, whether held virtually or in physical spaces, or ensuring online documents and forms are accessible and usable by assistive technology like screen readers, and adding automatic door openers to shared spaces like entrances, restrooms, and conference rooms.
Julie, another unique approach comes from the Ohio Department of Aging about supporting workers who are caregivers.
Michelle, yes, according to the Department of Aging, about 1 in 4 adults have the combined responsibility of working and being a caregiver for a loved one. This statistic did not specify the age of the caregiver, but anecdotally, we can anticipate at times this includes older adults with disabilities who are working and serving as a caregiver. Employees who have this combined responsibility know how challenging it can be. Employers can retain valuable employees who are also caregivers by offering accommodations such as leave of absence or permitting a reduction of work hours. The Department of Aging provides resources for employers who would like more information on ways to support these employees.
Julie, one last resource we have to share is near and dear to our hearts because it includes the services OOD offers to employees with disabilities and employers.
Michelle, I agree. I think many employers think of OOD already for their hiring needs and their questions related to making the hiring process and workplace accessible. However, we want to remind employers that our services to Ohioans with disabilities applies to individuals who are looking to both find and keep a job. That means if you have an employee who has aged into a disability and can benefit from OOD's vocational rehabilitation services to keep their job, we encourage them to apply for these no-cost services. Here's how you can help as their employer. Sometimes when an employee with a disability, any employee, including an older employee, requests a reasonable accommodation, neither the individual nor the employer are sure of what the effective solution is. In that case, OOD may be able to assist. During the interactive process, you can mention our services to the employee. Now, these services are confidential, so the employer cannot apply on behalf of the employee or ask the employee whether they have applied. But employers can share this as an option for the employee to consider to assist with identifying an effective solution to remain working. More information about our services is available at www.oodworks.com.
Julie, thank you for sharing these ideas and resources for employers to consider. With that, let's take one final break to see what additional questions have come in. So we have a comment, it looks like in relation to the question about telework as a reasonable accommodation. And it says, the EEOC just updated their guidance this week related to remote work as well, related to the end of the pandemic and ADA, might be good to mention. Another comment was, I like the youthful energy and fresh ideas of younger employees coupled with the patience and experience of older employees. As long as there's an atmosphere of mutual respect, it works well for us. Excellent point. Question that we have is, can you comment on a reasonable accommodation request for additional testing time during the selection process?
Yes, this is Julie. Thank you for that question. So we know employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations for the entire employment cycle. So that certainly includes the hiring process, which can include pre-employment testing or post-offer abilities type of testing. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are a variety of types of accommodations that employers can consider, and a common request during the hiring process for things like testing can be for additional time. This could be a need that a variety of people with a variety of disabilities have. One example might be a person who has a limitation with receiving information and the time it takes to process and formulate the response. And in that case, it might be beneficial to have additional time instead of taking a time-based assessment. And so that can be something that you consider in your interactive process. And again, what the effective solution is always a determination in that process. It's always case by case.
Thanks, Julie. And then we had a comment from Chris Spike from Fastenal. We have some adults who have hired in as part-time employees who had retired from full-time jobs. They often work alongside our high school students and provide a great example of attention to detail, accountability for mistakes, and professionalism. Oh, thanks for sharing. I like that. And then we have a couple more pre-submitted questions. So the first is, we did receive a pre-submitted question about mandatory retirement ages, and that is outside of our scope. However, I do want to mention that the EEOC has several resources that employers can consult that do address this. Another pre-submitted question, are there grant dollars available to help employers who employ people with disabilities?
Thank you, Michelle. This is Julie. So we are not familiar with grant dollars available for employers, but we are familiar with tax benefits that employers can consult with their tax professionals about to see if you're eligible for these. There are three that we're familiar with. We have a resource on our Inclusive Employer Toolkit that highlights these, but I want to share just a quick explanation of both. So the first is the Disabled Access Credit. This is for small businesses who incur expenses that are related to providing access for individuals with disabilities related to providing reasonable accommodations, sign language interpretation, and things like assistive technology. The second is the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. Employers who hire individuals with disabilities who are served by vocational rehabilitation may be able to apply for up to $2,400 per employee hired. And then the final tax benefit we're familiar with is the Architectural Barrier Removal Tax Deduction. And this one is a deduction up to $15,000 for qualified expenses that go towards removing barriers that have to do with architectural and transportation and related to the mobility of people with disabilities and older adults. So some examples might be the expense of widening a door, building a ramp, or modifying a vehicle. So again, talk with your tax professionals. We have a resource with more information and links to these tax benefits on our website.
Thanks, Julie. One more question. Since this is Mental Health Awareness Month, can you give us numbers reflecting where aging employees and mental health issues might intersect?
Yes, thank you for this question. I'd like to say this is our 30th anniversary of providing webinars, and we kicked off the first one in May of 2020, and it was focused on mental health in the workplace, and that one is archived on our website. We also talked about mental health disabilities in our Employers Reasonable Accommodation Handbook webinar series. This month is also Older Americans Month, and so we went the route of starting this two-part series with the aging into a disability topic. But I appreciate the question bringing both of these important topics together. So because I had some time to research this information in advance, what we found from the World Health Organization is that approximately 15% of adults aged 60 and over have a mental health condition. The statistic did not specify whether these were working older adults or just an aggregate of older adults. But thank you for that question and bringing these two topics together.
Thanks, Julie. Well, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Julie, what closing thoughts do you have?
Michelle, I found the information we used in today's webinar to be especially interesting. It fascinates me to know we have the gift of 5 generations in the workplace. The combination of that knowledge, experience, and wisdom, coupled with the opportunity to mentor and share innovative ideas, is a real benefit to today's employers. People are living longer and healthier lives and are choosing to work past the traditional retirement years. Because it can be common to age into a disability, it's likely employers have older employees with disabilities in their workforce. I hope the strategies we shared today for providing reasonable accommodations and creating inclusive workplace cultures inspires employers to foster environments where they can retain this valuable workforce. Remember, OOD is here to help. So if you have questions or goals related to hiring, retaining, and advancing qualified employees with disabilities, including older employees with disabilities, please contact us. We appreciate your continued interest in our employer webinars. I'd like to thank our amazing team who helps with all aspects of making sure these webinars are a success. And to you, Michelle, it's been wonderful to co-host with you today.